That's us. Welcome, folks. Future Work Scotland. I'm your host for this evening, Sathpal Singh, Sath. I'm joined by my co-hosts and co-organisers, Donald Henderson, Mickey Bennett. Warm welcome to you if this is your first time with us. Recognise a few familiar faces. If you've been with us before, welcome back. Just the usual formalities. We do have a code of conduct. In short, we simply ask that you're respectful to one another. We want everyone to have a great time, great experience. And we will do the usual sort of community shout outs at the end. If you do have questions for Gerry, just drop them in the chat for us as we go. Prefix them with a Q and we'll relay them back. Gerry's got about 45 minutes worth of a kind of talk that he wants to do, so we've got plenty of time, and if he wants to stop at any point, we'll take a wee break. It's quite a small group, so we'll keep it very flexible and informal. Everything you're used to with our group. And yeah, I'm delighted to welcome Gerry Osborne to Work Scotland this evening as our guest speaker. We've got to know Gerry a little bit over the last wee while. He had kindly previously invited Donald and I to some leadership dialogue sessions with the McChrystal Group, where he is the UK partner. And of course, as you probably know, McChrystal Group is General Stanley McChrystal's organisation. He wrote The Wonderful Team of Teams. I'm sure some of you have read that. Gerry himself has got a very impressive background, and I don't have enough time to go through it all. So you'll catch it in our meetup listing. But he's run his own consultancy. He's done a lot of great work in strategic sort of operations and communications. Spent years in the British Army. Every time I read through it, I'm thinking I can't think of anything the man hasn't done. There we go. And he's travelled a bit as well, so I'm sure there'll be lots of great insights this evening. And really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have around hybrid working, which is obviously very topical for most of us and been hotly debated. So I'm very interested to see what Gerry has for us this evening. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Gerry. Gerry, floor is yours.
Thanks, Seth. Really, really great to be here, guys, and thanks very much. And I don't mind spending my evenings. As I say, I'm very happy to be indoors this evening. I wasn't quite so happy to be indoors for the rest of today, and I've come from one meeting to another. So, I mean, it's just a sign, isn't it, that we pivot from meeting to meeting like this, and that's our life now. And it just makes, I think it gives you more choice of what you do for the evening, for your evenings and your after work activities. So look, delighted to be talking to you today. I'm going to share my screen just a second, see if my technical wizardry is going to keep up with this, and hopefully you should see my slides. Can someone give me a thumbs up? Yeah, great, fantastic. And as Seth said, look, I'd really like this to be a dialogue, guys. Seth was talking about the fact that at McChrystal Group in the European office, we have a thing called Leaders Dialogue once a month. So we get CEOs or even just small-time shop owners to come and meet with each other and discuss what they want to discuss, the common leadership issues that are affecting them at any point in time. And it's been a great networking activity for us, particularly because if you think about it, and I'm glad to hear that so many of you are enthusiastic about Team of Teams, but it is actually an American management book, which is actually quite difficult to sell in the UK and European market. I've bravely told Stanley McChrystal a couple of times that he's trying to get me to sell a Broadway opening night in London's West End, or Glasgow's Theatre District, when it's raining in the middle of winter. And when he asks me what I mean by that, I say, well, come on, Stan, you're a VIP in America. You regularly go to Broadway opening nights. It's all red carpets, it's tuxedos and tiaras and limousines and champagne. You go into a beautiful theatre with a modern interior, you sit on a velour seat, and because you're really nice to each other in America, you turn to the person next to you and you say, this is going to be great. Okay, now if you go to an opening night in the West End, it's probably a Thursday in winter, so the theatre doesn't want to take too much risk on an opening night by a British playwright. It's in a Victorian theatre with a seat that was made for Victorians, so you know you're going to be uncomfortable all night. The floor's sticky. You've probably, if you're lucky, managed time to get in from a really awful day at work through the rain, being covered with water by a taxi, and you've had half of a pint of bitter or a glass of wine out of a plastic glass, which was the wrong temperature. And by the time it gets to the curtain going up, you turn to the person next to you and say, I really hope this is going to be better than what I saw last week. And that is what selling an American consultancy product is like in the European market. Okay, but I think it's an elegant approach. And why do I say that? I was lucky enough to be there at the start of the story, actually, and I'll get onto the title, because you're probably thinking, on message, what the hell's that got to do with hybrid working, and what the hell's that got to do with the future of work? I hope to convince you that messaging and communications needs to sit at the heart of everything that we do tonight. But my story actually starts, gosh, 1988, when I joined the British Army. And I went through Sandhurst, and I was lucky enough to do pilot training, and I flew helicopters for most of my military career, and very fortunately became part of the Special Forces aviation sort of speciality in the British Army. Ended up with me being the executive officer of an organisation called the Joint Special Forces Aviation Wing down at RAF Odin, which was half RAF and half Army, and I was the XO that had to bring it together with an RAF boss. So you can see that whilst on message for a military pilot or a military officer or a soldier or anything like that is all about scanning frequencies and getting all the right information that you can so that you're on the message that needs to be given, it also very quickly becomes about being in the cultural space of the team that you're working with. Okay, so the RAF have a very different culture to the Army, and particularly in aviation. So that was a really challenging role that I took through there. But interestingly, I think this title is probably more relevant to pretty much everything I've done since I started my working life, because on message also meant in the military that you followed orders. You're on message, okay? You're doing what you're told to do. Whereas when I went into the communications industry, and the route that I took into that was that I finished my flying days and went to a staff job in the Ministry of Defence, which was all around psychological operations. It was about putting the strategic narrative at the heart of military operations worldwide. So, you know, writing the why, we were sending planes, trains, and automobiles to far-flung countries to carry out the Queen's orders or NATO's mission or whatever it's going to be. And very happy to take questions on that at the end of that, because I know it's been a particularly interesting few weeks as far as how far we managed to put the message at the heart of what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. So yes, hold that thought and test me. I will very happily give you my opinion. I don't want to be drawn too much on whether or not it's been a success or a failure or anything like that. The fact is, I think we were there, we did it, and we were very much on message. We were carrying out the tasks that were set for us. So very interesting perspective of that definition as you come through the military. But because I was in that strategic communications speciality towards the end of my career, I ended up unintentionally going into the advertising world. And I did that because there was an organisation, a company called M&C Saatchi in London. You may have heard of them. Maurice and Charles Saatchi, used to be called Saatchi and Saatchi, who changed their advertising agency to become a worldwide global network of advertising P&Ls, profit and loss accounts, enabling people to set up specialist communications departments. And the one I worked for was called M&C Saatchi World Services. It was set up by about 6 of us who saw an opportunity, having come from the military, to sell proper creative communications products to countries, to governments, to security organizations, so that they would be able to put communications at the heart of what they wanted to do, rather than just tee up an operation and ask communicators to make it look better. So the on message there was very much about being culturally nuanced to the theatres in which we were working with. And we were trying to de-radicalise children, for example, in the Horn of Africa. We were trying to reinforce messaging in Eastern Europe against malign Russian narrative, and using the creative advertising techniques that existed in the wonderful world of Soho, where all the advertising agencies live, to bring that impact to people that really were trying to change people's behaviour. And I'm still doing work now on the side with the government of Georgia, in fact, who are, if you think about Georgia, it's a really challenged nation. It wants to be European, it's desperate to join the EU, it's desperate to join NATO, but it's still got Russian soldiers camped on its soil. And it's a really difficult message to get across to the Georgian people. So lots of work to be done. And then, of course, I was lucky enough, because I was in that Special Forces community, to be one of the rotational advisors to what was emerging in Iraq in 2003 as the Joint Special Operations Command, led by Stan McChrystal. And that, I'll give you a quick story of how that was formed later on this evening. But basically, I had to go and become part of this headquarters, which was so many silos of truly, truly elite people, much more elite than I was. I was just one of the bus drivers, and had to get involved in making this a whole mission to make sure that the teams came together much more than the sum of their parts. And I think that's where Stan McChrystal really worked some magic. If you can think about the guys with the biggest knuckles and the biggest beards and the largest rifles, all of them know that what they're doing is absolutely terrific. They're elite. They're absolutely the world's best of the best. But get them to work together and try and align their cultures. And I very quickly recognised what I'd seen in the RAF and the Army unit I'd worked in. And also I was lucky to work in Australia. And I'm very happy to give my opinion on how to influence Australians later on as well, if you want to talk about that. And so I saw something different in Stan McChrystal's headquarters, because people were coming together, people were sharing information, and it was a great place to work. And because it was all highly classified, I parked it and thought, I'll never go back to that sort of organisation again, until I heard they were setting up an office here in London. And a mate of mine asked me for lunch and said, would you like to rejoin the team? And at the time, it was predominantly military people, ex-military people that were there. And McChrystal Group is now about 20% military and 80% non-military. So we bring in behavioural psychologists, and we bring in digital analytics specialists, and we bring in consultants from other organisations as well to help organisations achieve that same effect, to get them to move quicker, to outpace their organisation, their environment, to outpace crisis, to outpace their competitors by speeding up that process. And it's all about decision. And I think where this pivots to where we are now is that organisation, if you think about it, was trying to defeat the rise of a viral ideology at the time. And what we've all gone through in the last 2 years is the rise of a virus. And it's spread, the way it's spread and the way we've had to react to it has been very, very similar, which is one of the reasons that McChrystal Group has been so busy since we set up the European office here, and actually doing a lot of work in America. So On Message now really becomes part of, how do you get organisations aligned? How do you get the people who've got very individual perspectives of where they are in their organisations, or where they are in the world, to think in a similar way that will produce positive outcomes? So I think that's why I want to call this On Message. And of course, I want to talk to you about the subject of message. So it's Gerry Osborne On Message, about what message is, because I think I've had a bit of experience of that. And right from early days, when my family used to tell me I worried too much about what people think, I think that's actually a critical skill that we all need to have more of, particularly in the 20th century, as this slide depicts, in a massively interconnected and fast-moving information environment. So I guess where that comes round to is, what we say has now become so much more important. And in these leaders' dialogues that we've been holding recently, I've had a lot of feedback, and when I've asked people what they want to talk about, people say, Gerry, I just want to know what to say to people about getting vaccinated. I just want to know how to tell people to come back to the office without them taking it the wrong way. I just want to know what to say in the wake of Black Lives Matter, because we all feel we should say something. And actually, that might not be the right thing to do at the time. So it's around gathering context for that. And making sure that the message, what you say, and of course what you follow up and do afterwards, sits at the heart of what you do. But it's really important for this environment here, I think, and this is where it comes to what I want to talk to you guys about tonight, because we are seeing some really, really interesting behaviour from organisations at the moment. I'd love to know what you guys think about this. So yeah, please don't just put questions in the chat. Put your points in there as well, because I'd love to sort of pick up on everything and have a discussion about that. My wife works in the financial sector. The chief executive of the organisation that she works for has said that everyone's got to go back to the office 3 days a week, and that one of those days must be a Monday or a Friday. And that, by the way, here is the dress code, in case you've forgotten it, for the office, and that this is going to be monitored. And her reply is, this sounds a lot like school, because you're being told when you've got to go, what times, which days you're allowed to not be there, and you've got being told what to wear. And this is fascinating. And there's two perspectives to this, because if 2 years ago, in a full-time job in the financial sector, I'd been told that I was working 3 days a week in the office and 2 days working from home, I'd probably have bitten my employer's arm off. I would have loved to have done that. And yet now it seems like it's a brutal regime that's being imposed upon us. So hasn't the context changed? But at the same time, people are driving their own agendas here at the top of organizations to say, I've got to get people into the office, otherwise the conditions on my lease might be different, the company might start losing money, so how do I do that? And we're seeing some very draconian messaging coming out. So I guess what has happened in COVID, from my perspective, is that there is more what I call activating opinion out there than there ever has been, certainly since I've been looking at the communications world. And what I mean by that is people's opinions that's driving people to have emotional reactions and possibly behave differently in a far greater amount. So creating really bad messaging, creating really bad behavior in organizations, and that can create really, really difficult organizational problems. And I think it's going to be very interesting with what we're predicting to be the great resignation after Christmas, when people have finally figured out if they've got their bonuses and they're actually going to leave organizations, because I think people have changed the way they work. There's been a fundamental change in the world and we cannot ignore it. And I think how that affects the future of work is going to be a really interesting debate that we keep having on and on. Does anyone want to come back at me with just anything about that opening chat? I see Nikki, you've put in the chat there to two days a month to connect.
Yeah, and it's been badged that we shouldn't commute to compute. So when we're actually syncing with people, connecting and really driving collaboration. But that's okay for me because I'm a people leader and that totally makes sense. I just worry that the 2 days a month blanket approach, if you're not a people leader and your team is not co-located, how is that all going to work? So it's really got to be holistic, I feel.
I think I really like that. Don't commute to compute. So I really like that phrase.
Yeah, you can steal it if you want. I work for a big bank, a UK retail bank as well. So just steal it. It's fine.
Okay. We go with it anyway. And to Sheila's question, is there a great resignation? You're probably right. I am probably picking that up more as a phrase that's being used in the US, but I am alive also to the fact that the UK jobs market has never been more vibrant than it is at the moment. People are looking for people to go and work for them. So it's almost a buyer's market out there at the moment. So I think there will be, I think some of that behavior that we're seeing in the States may well drift over here. People say, well, okay, if I'm not allowed to explore this lifestyle that I've developed over the last year or so, I just can't see myself going back to something that's different. And I'm going to go look for work elsewhere. So I think those conditions of work, certainly that the change that has happened is that conditions of work are a much more significant part of the job offer that people have. So thanks very much. I'll just have a look at one more comment there. You don't have to be physically in a room with someone to connect with them. Lindsay, is it Lindsay? Do you want to expand on that?
It is, yeah. I kind of was maybe about 20 years ahead of the curve on this. I've never believed you have to see the whites of somebody's eyes to know they're doing a good job. It's in the work, it's in their understanding of vision, it's in the relationship. If you need to see somebody in an office to know they're working, you need to look at yourself on what your expectations of leadership are.
Yeah, great. I think there's two sides of that I've picked up in conversation, Lindsay, is that I think you're absolutely right. One thing that, we've all done Zoom, we're all 3 feet away from each other permanently now. Have you noticed that? So there's nobody sitting at the top of the boardroom table and not at the bottom of the boardroom table anymore. And actually that's created a more equitable and what I'll talk about psychologically safe environment in many organizations. And there's many good things. Obviously we're more productive as well. The one piece of advice I have received about going back to the office is that when junior people look to more experienced people and pick up what they're doing through a sort of osmosis process of how they develop themselves, that is probably missing to a degree, I would suggest, at the moment, because you don't get it in a 1-hour Zoom call because it's functional and it's disciplined and it should be. You only do what you need to do, but that sort of observing behavior in the office is something you can learn from as well, good and bad. But I like that, Lindsay. I think it's a really good point to raise, and it just shows the strength of the depth of feeling. So listen, I'm just rabbiting onto the introduction here. What I want to cover this evening is these 3 things, as Sath very kindly put out to you. I want to talk about the belief battle space. Battle space is what we used to deploy our military forces into, and I think it is a battle space. You've got to compete in the information environment, but it's not just about what you say and what you receive. It's about what you believe now, and I think that's more than anything. And I think that is something you should take away as probably some advice on how to approach it. The second thing I want to talk about is what I consider to be the 3 critical components of communication. That's reach, how far the message goes; rhythm, how syncopated it is; and content, you know, what the tune is basically. And I always think of these in musical terms. I'm a terrible musician, by the way. And then finally, I want to just wrap up by saying something that has always been my passion, which is putting communications at the heart of strategy and at the heart of everything we do, rather than just doing stuff and getting communicators to make it look good afterwards, because I think we can all cite some experience of that. Now, if you get bored, there's a little puzzle I want you to do that's on the right-hand side of the slide there. So if you copy that shape down onto a piece of paper, just the square and the 9 dots in it, and if you get bored, if you find yourself drifting off and you want something more entertaining to do, try and connect all of the dots in that square with 4 straight lines without taking your pen off the paper. Okay, that's the puzzle I want you to do. So, and we'll come back to it maybe and see how people are getting on later on. So that's kind of I'm laying out my stall there. So let's get into this first thing about the belief battle space. And this is the title of a LinkedIn article I wrote a couple of years ago. You know, are you receiving me? Are you believing me? And I think actually this reflects the 20th century versus the 21st century. Because if you think about communications and work, it used to be a question of, are you receiving me? It used to be a question of leaders giving their orders to followers in context and actually then being judged on the results that were achieved as a result of that communication. It could be a directive, it could be a project or anything like that, but it was very much one way. Are you receiving me? Which is why I love the picture of the sergeant major in the bottom left right hand side of the corner. Now it's about, are you believing me? And if you think about being in the military and a character like that shouting at you in the 21st century and saying, are you receiving me? You can say yes, but I don't believe you. That has a different outcome to the way you perceive what you're hearing in terms of communication. So I think that is the difference between the 20th and the 21st century. And I want to give you an example before we start. You will probably have all seen these 2 photographs before. Okay, and you've probably seen the debate that raged around them. Okay, so they are both photographs, aerial photographs of 2 inaugurations, one of Barack Obama in 2009 and one of Donald Trump in 2017. There's the reason you see them together is because they create controversy. Actually, they're pretty boring pictures in terms of content, aren't they? They really are. But the hype that surrounds them is still to this day something that people talk about. And I think it's really, really interesting because there was a very clever guy called Brian Schaffner, who was at the University of Massachusetts Political Science, who decided to do a very amateur poll of specimen audiences who were around these 2 events, around the latter event in 2017. And he basically polled, 1,400 people, 1,400 people, and split those populations into 2 groups, so 700 in each. And he asked the first population a very simple question. He said, which of these photographs is which inauguration is which? And of course, they didn't have the labels on them at the time when he showed them to you. So he said, which is Trump's and which is Obama's? Now, interestingly, 41% of Trump voters got that question wrong. And perhaps interestingly as well, 8% of voters for Hillary Clinton got that question wrong as well. But 22%, but only 2% of the people that didn't vote got that question wrong. So that's interesting, isn't it? First of all, you've basically got Trump voters who are being more influenced to answer something that's wrong, and actually a certain percentage of Clinton's voters, but a very tiny percentage of people who didn't actually have a stake in the argument at all were convinced that it was wrong. And that's an interesting point as well. Now, the second question he asked was, which picture has more people in it? So 700 people were asked which of those 2 photographs has more people in it. Interestingly, 15% of Trump voters still got the answer to that question wrong, which is a lesser number, but it's still a significant number, okay? 3% of Clinton voters got it wrong, And only 2% again of the no votes got that question wrong as well. So really, what this proves is nothing about the relative intellectual abilities of Republican and Democrat voters in the States. It doesn't really prove anything about politics. What it proves is the more invested emotionally people are in a campaign, the more likely they are to completely ignore logic. Okay, and actually out of this has come a phrase which I've used a couple of times, that emotion trumps logic every time. And hence he had quite a good brand name for that. So that is the belief battle space, when you can actually, you'll physically dump a logical graphic of representation that's positioned in front of you, even when it's presented to you, if you're emotionally involved in the scenario. Now, the second thing you've got to remember about the modern information environment is this, and I don't know if anyone's seen this before. This is called the hype cycle. It was actually created by Gartner. Gartner actually sort of track technology onto markets, and if you imagine an iPhone coming out onto the market, it's the popularity of that piece of technology as it comes out, which Gartner say reaches very rapidly a peak of inflated expectation. So this is the best iPhone in the world. It's got a fantastic camera, etc., etc. Very quickly, it's taken down by critique to what they call a trough of disillusionment. Breaks in your back pocket. It's not as good as they thought it was. B, it's rubbish, and then actually comes back to what they call a plateau of performance. And that is the way I believe that information actually is presented to us in the information environment in the 21st century. It gets to hype first, which is probably completely untrue. Fake news, call it what you want. It is very quickly taken down, but then eventually the true story emerges. And I always give the example of MH17, the Ukrainian Airways flight that was shot down by the Russians. You know, the Russia Today came straight on TV and said, nothing to do with us. It was all these other fantastical things that it could have been. And they took the story down very quickly. And of course, eventually then the inquiry proved that it was a Russian missile that shot that down. So think about this. That is the way that information is presented to you on a daily basis. It comes with hype first, and then you get the truth afterwards. That's what happens in the modern information age, because you don't have time to go through a proof thing. So the game we are in is this: perception versus reality. And it's one that the advertising world know very, very well. You know what the very positive attributes of your brand promise is, and that's the sun shining, okay? Now, the trouble is, to the onlooker, they can't see that because there's this massive thing called a moon in the middle, which is an inaccurate perception, for whatever reason, about what your brand promise is, about your value proposition is. And you can't make the sun shine brighter, okay? You also can't move the moon. So in communications terms, all you can do is change the position of the onlooker. And it's a very old sort of proven methodology in the advertising world. And you do it via creating a powerful, sustainable narrative. And a narrative isn't just a statement. A narrative is a dialogue. It's something that you have with your audiences all the time, and you need to reinforce the impact and the belief of that conversation. And actually, when it goes wrong, it's really interesting. I was just talking to Sath and to Donald at the beginning of this session about Stan's new book, which is going to be called Risk User's Guide. And he talks about narrative and communication being two of the what he calls the risk control factors that we can actively prepare ourselves better for to deal with risk if we have powerful narrative and communications. And there's an example of when it went wrong. It's a Scottish example. There's the head of Brewdog there who had prided his organization. I don't know if anyone works there, I hope not, but I love the beer, love their products, love their brand. Everything that they were doing is sustainable. It was developing young people. It was innovative. And it was supposed to be a very fair place to work. And this is what the CEO said to people very publicly. He was very behind this brand. Until about 2 months ago, 60 ex-workers wrote a public letter on Twitter and said it was the most toxic organization that they've been in their life. So that straight away, that narrative came down to a trough of disillusionment. And it takes a long time to recover from something like that. And what Stan says in his book is that when you have narrative misalignment, in other words, when you say one thing and do something else, these are the things it creates. Cynicism. You know, there's the gap between what you say and what you do. Trust goes out the window. Priorities become muddled. Tensions become more prevalent, and you get brand damage. And so I just put this up to you as a sort of, and summarizing really what we're saying in this first section, because you must close that say-do gap in the modern information environment. Because what you want to create in your organizations is trust, and trust comes from people feeling psychologically safe to raise a point and not have their arm bitten off for it. And psychological safety is a very interesting thing as well, because we talk about psychological safety a lot. And if you get the chance to read Amy Edmondson's books on this, she did a lot of analysis about psychological safety in medical teams. Really, really talented writer and researcher. But she says it must be matched with accountability as well. Sorry, does someone have a question there?
I was just going to say Amy Edmondson is coming to speak with us in the new year. So yeah, I'm a big fan of her work. Yeah.
Great. Well, you'll probably do a much better job than I will of this. But the point I want to make here is that we see everybody craves psychological safety, but psychological safety must be balanced with accountability. And if you've read her book, you understand why. Because a lot of organizations start off, and we see this in a lot of startups, with what we call low psychological safety and low accountability. So nothing's really happening. Okay, because nobody can raise their arm, nobody can, it often happens in very new organizations. Very quickly though, if they are a startup and they're a bit funky and they're getting something really good going, you reach what we call the comfort zone. High psychological safety, but when people have a good idea, quick as a flash, nothing happens about it. And that's a really interesting stage of a startup, but it typically is that stage of being a startup before the startup has to grow up. And that's really, really important as well. And there's trust, loads of trust in the organization, but nothing's really happening either. Frequently, what then happens is they get bored and people come in to impose accountability into the organization. The pendulum immediately swings the other way. So you have low psychological safety and high accountability. And that reminds me quite a lot of the military, actually. And so you're in this constant anxiety zone where nobody is going to put their hands up. And of course, what you want is what we call a learning zone. Because if your company can learn, if your organization can learn and develop, because that's what it needs to do to develop, it needs to be a learning organization. You need to have high psychological safety, but you need to also encourage a positive message around accountability. You know, I'm going to give Sath this role to carry out because I know Sath is going to carry it out. You know, he's really good, and make him feel really positively accountable for the work he's done. And then if something goes wrong, it goes wrong despite us having to try a new thing rather than going wrong because we failed to do something. And that's the difference in an organization. So you'll get some great tips from Amy Edmondson. I've never heard her speak before. Maybe I can come along to that. Well, I'd love to do that. Great. So I guess that's really where I want to finish up that first bit. And I would say that, you know, in addressing this new information battle space, call it the 21st century, just remember that you're dealing with something that's called perception versus reality, and there is a constant battle between that. Okay, and you can't make perception real. I can't make you think in a certain way because the amount of information that we get to form our opinions is more than ever we had. You need to close the say-do gap. As a leader of an organization, you must demonstrate what you say to people you're going to demonstrate. And then finally, I think you need to balance this psychological safety and accountability. And that's really the trick to sort of having a successful organization. So how does communications fit into that? Well, these are the three key components of communications that I've come to know and love. You know, reach, how far your message is going to get, spread laterally, distance, how far, how frequently it's going to be pulsed, because that has an impact on the outcome of your message, and the content. And I've put content last because I want to deal with that later. Because reach and rhythm is really what McChrystal Group was set up to do. And if you've read the Team of Teams story, the basic synopsis of that is that when Stan took command of the JSOC after 9/11, he found all these elite teams that were doing a great job individually, but they weren't talking to each other. And in order to defeat the adversary he faced, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was a networked organization, he had to make that organization behave more like a network. And in order to do that, he has to do two things. Set up the processes, first of all, to share information, but then adjust the behaviors to make sure that people wanted to share information. And only then could he do that. In the Team of Teams book, you'll probably remember this quote, you know, the world has changed. You can't solve 20th century problems with 21st century problems with 20th century solutions. And that's really what his awakening was when he started the Team of Teams journey. And yet it's amazing, isn't it? Because we probably all still work in organizations that look like this. And if I asked you to sort of pinpoint what organisation that was, I think you'd probably be surprised to hear that that slide is what that picture is 100 years old. And isn't it amazing that we still use that kind of structure to dictate how we organise our workspaces at the moment? And there's very good reasons for that, okay? Because we know this is predictable, this is stable. This is organised. We know where we're going to work. We know who we're going to talk to on a regular basis, and we know how to get information decisions made upon high. And that's really good. Okay, and so I wouldn't want my paycheck done by an accounts department that looked like a network. I'd rather it was done by a hierarchy, because I want a predictable paycheck every month. So what we advocate is not to replace hierarchy, because no one's done it for 100 years. With a pure network solution, but you do want to adapt, to try and take on those two key behaviors of hierarchies and networks: the stability and independence of a hierarchy, the independence and the agility of a network, and you want to combine them. And so you can still leave the structure of an organization correctly, but you need to set up pathways to share information across, not just up and down. And that's the first step that you take in making an organization more adaptable, sustainably adaptable to exist in the 21st century. The second part is having these characteristics of high-performing teams. And again, if you read the book, you'll see there are 4. And I always ask people to remember the best team they were ever on, whether it was playing in a band, whether it was being on a sports team, whether it was a debating team, whether it was, you know, just you and your mates who used to go on holiday together once a year. These are the characteristics that you'll find in a high-performing small team. Trust. Everyone trusts each other because everyone's got a common purpose, common goal. Everyone's driving towards the same thing, which subordinates people in that team to a greater mission. There's that shared consciousness, not just talking to people, but kind of knowing what they're going to say. You know, it's why footballers are so good at, you know, crossing in and heading in. It's just they practice it so much that there's just an expectation this is going to go well. Unless it's Leicester City, of course. But there we go. And then, of course, all of those lead up to what Stan calls empowered execution. Because if you have empowerment, you can trust people to do the right thing, and that's how it goes on. And I think, you know, this being established in a world where he was trying to defeat a viral ideology really now applies to worlds in which we're trying to get organizations to work in what I'm calling the infodemic of COVID-19 as well. So those are the characteristics you read in the book, and those basically are what you need to do to your organizations. And there's one more element to it, and this is also about reach and rhythm of communications, is that leadership changed in the 21st century. If I asked you to name great leaders of the 20th century, I'm sure you could rattle off 2 or 3, even if you weren't even born in that era. If I ask you to name great leaders of the 21st century, most people come up with that Barack Obama, but very few people know great leaders. And that's what Stan says in his second book, Leaders, Myth and Reality, actually his 4th book in total, but the second leadership book, is that leadership has changed. Leadership isn't what we think it is, and it never was. Leadership is something that not just leaders do to followers in context, but leadership now sits at the heart of leaders, followers, and context. And all of those 3 things can change in a moment's notice. And so we have to be adaptable as leaders to all of those changes. And there's no list of leadership qualities anymore, like you might have read from Nelson Mandela or anyone like that. There are behaviors that we all have that we need to modulate to a certain degree depending on what context we face. And that's the difference. We need great leadership, but not great leaders anymore, because the opinions of people have a real vote in that now. Moving on, that's the sort of 3 aspects of the team of teams approach. And it's largely, as I say, focused on reach and rhythm of communications. So how do you get all that reach and rhythm of communications going to where you need to be? You need to change the process, and you need to change the individual behaviors of an organization. That's team of teams in a nutshell. But what it doesn't deal with, and what it hasn't dealt with today, and what we're starting now to deal with, and I find this very exciting in McChrystal Group, is content. And that's why I want to talk about communications at the heart of strategy as the last sort of part of what I want to talk to you about tonight. Chicken and egg, you know, what comes first, communications or strategy? Okay, and actually I remember very clearly when I used to work in the MOD, I used to go to what was called a crisis coordination meeting, If it was Ebola or if it was Mali or something like that, everyone would get spun up into an absolute frenzy. We'd sit around a table and we'd go through land forces, naval forces, air forces, and everyone would say, is everyone ready to go? What comments have we got? And then right at the end, they'd come down to me at the end of the table and say, Gerry, have you got anything to add from communications perspective at the end? And of course, that was just trying to, forgive the term, polish a turd in glitter. We'd already decided we were going to send infrastructure away to some far-flung country, and now communications were asked to make it look good. And that, of course, is something you cannot do in the 21st century. I'm going to pause because someone just put a question in there. John, would you say that EQ is far more important in the 21st century, or has it always been important? I would say always, but I think far more. You need to, the more you can relate to the audiences you deal with in communications, the better your leadership will be, not just your communication. Does that answer your question?
It does indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so how do you do this? Well, if you think about Stan's, how do you put communications at the heart of strategy? If you think about this leadership model, it applies, it's got a direct link to communications. So change leadership for communication. Communication in the 21st century sits at the intersection between speakers and audiences and context. Okay, and so you must apply exactly the same approach. Gone are the days where we can just communicate to like the Sergeant Major on my earlier slide and expect things to be done. It just won't be. It just won't be, because people have a vote now. Opinion has a vote. And it's really, really important, because the link between communications and leadership is absolutely rife. And so that's why I developed this last couple of years, and we're developing this more in McChrystal Group now, this 5-step process. Any of you who've worked in government, if you've seen the government communication service before, you'll have seen a thing called the OASIS model, which is similar but not quite the same. It starts off, it's basically a process of how you put communications at the heart of everything you do. And it means you start off by talking about objectives first in communications terms and in audience focused terms before you actually look at the audience. So you've got to know what you want to achieve, what's the behavioural change you want to achieve, and how you will know that's happened in which population before you then go on to analyse the audiences you want to communicate to. And once you've done that, only then can you use connections, people call it creativity in the advertising industry, to connect the audience to the objective. Only when you've done those 3 steps can you then orchestrate your campaign. And this is not just advertising, this is how you deal with your people on a daily basis. It's actually how you organise a successful family Christmas dinner to make sure it doesn't end in tears. It's exactly the same principles. It's called human behaviour. And then finally, you need to measure. You need to measure what you've done and how successfully you've been done. You need to prove what you've done to the audiences that you've engaged with. And if you haven't done, then you need to go around the loop again. And I call it the OCOM model, and we're looking to develop this, as I say, more in McChrystal Group at the moment. So let me just give you a quick few highlights of that, and then we'll finish off, and I'd love to take your questions. Firstly, objectives. You will recognise this as smart objective setting. It's called smart goal setting as well. Okay, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. We've all done it. You know, we've all said that was the way you set up a really pucker-gen objective in the modern world. Well, that is the way you used to do it in the 21st century, because that is through the perception of the person setting the objective. But the 21st century isn't about that person anymore, it's about the audience. And so you need now smart objective setting in audience terms. And if you've had a chance to read my TEDx talk I did in Tbilisi a couple of years, you'll have seen this. I think that these are much more relevant smart objective settings now. Firstly, make your message simple enough that everyone understands in your audience, meaningful to the audience. Don't use jargon, don't use abbreviations that people don't understand, because you're just killing the message straight away. Make sure it's appropriate to the cultural norms of the audience. Okay, and that's something we've never done before. We never had the realization that we have to do as much before. And I'm not just talking across cultures and countries, I'm talking across departments, different departments of organizations, because they have different cultures in them as well. So find out what those cultural norms are and make sure your messaging is appropriate. Make sure it's reasonable. And when I say reasonable, I mean reasonable in the expectations of your audience. Because if you tell them something that's going to be way, way more than they could ever hope to achieve, they just won't engage with it. It's too ambitious. And then finally, trackable. Because the success of the objective, the success of the communications campaign you're going to have to put out there has to be trackable not by you, by the audience. So you need to make it easier to track. But it's never been easier to do that, frankly, with social media the way it is. But you need to think about your messaging as how it will be tracked by the audience in terms of the success it gains. So that's basically my sort of new theory on smart objective setting. When you define audiences, you go on to the second stage. These are just some things to think about. You have a primary and secondary audience. My primary audience tonight is you guys. The secondary audience, which is by definition hopefully bigger than the primary audience, is the people that you will talk to. Okay, and that secondary audience has to be important to me when I'm talking to you tonight. So hopefully I'm thinking about who you're going to talk about when I talk to you. Then you need to think about who are the influencers and who are the advocates in your audience. So who's going to have the high reach, the high personality to carry your message, but not necessarily care too much about the content? And who are the real scientific advocates of your content, of what you're saying, that really put the credibility behind it? Because each has a role in your message. And both of those are what we call allies. And then you can prioritize your audience. And if you know that much about them, you can prioritize them according to how much skill they've got to pass your message on, how much will they've got to pass it on. And don't pick a target audience that's got low skill and low will, because it's a waste of time. And this is a balance of investment decision about where you put your communications activity. Of course, don't forget the hill as well, because the interference that you'll experience in that message is something you need to be aware of as well. So connections. Then you come on to the creative connection between the audience and the objective. Now, and this is where I've got to stop and say, did anyone solve the puzzle? And if you have done, can you hold it up to the camera? John's got his hand up. Do you want to show us, John?
I only did it in my head. Okay, let me find a post-it.
Oh, no, don't worry. Don't worry. Anyone else?
Yeah.
I'm going to show you what I think John's done. I think he's done this. Now, that is the only way to connect those 9 dots with 4 straight lines without taking your pen off the paper. And you have to do it by going outside of the boundary. Now, this is a test of creativity. Okay, and actually most of us get this wrong because we have been institutionalized all of our lives. And there's no mistake, by the way, that there's a box around it. There's no mistake I put a shadow behind the box to make the box look even more apparent. Okay, so it's a great party trick to play on people. We used to put this in a comic book that we used to put into the Horn of Africa when I was at Saatchi for kids to do. And we'd find out, and 95% of kids get this right. They actually achieve it because they don't see the box. All you've been asked to do is draw 4 straight lines, and so they don't see it. Adults find it much more difficult. So we've got a problem. We're not naturally creative as adults when we get to leadership positions. And this is why, you know, advertising agencies have young creative departments that get paid lots of money. So
actually, one of my very smart children decided if you had a long enough line, you could circumnavigate the world and do it in one line.
Yeah,
but
yeah, absolutely. And because you see, they don't see the restrictions. We are clouded, our judgment is clouded by restriction the older we get. Okay, and especially if you spend time in places like the military as well. So, you know, when we say thinking outside the box, we've got to be really aware that as adults, we're not that good at it. Well, that's not true. Some of us are better than others, but all of us could be better. So how do we leverage creativity to create that connection? Well, there's lots of great stuff out there that you can look at to do that. There's, you know, Bob Cialdini's 6 Principles of Influence and Persuasion. Great book, thoroughly recommend it. Written in 1984, and still is relevant today. You know, you've got to make that feeling of reciprocity in your messaging. I'm giving you something to give something back. You've got to make your message scarce enough that people gravitate towards it. It has to have authority. It has to have consistency with what other people are saying, consensus or social proof amongst your audience, and liking. You know, people have got to like what you're saying. That's how you achieve influence. That's what you can leverage that to create, to establish creative solutions to your communication. And you can only do it if you understand your audiences. You can also leverage storytelling. There's a storytelling arc there. You know, stories go through a typical, here's the beginning of the story, it gets complicated to a climax and then gets resolved. And then you've also got to remember in the rhythm section down here that the hype cycle, you don't just get one hype cycle, so that when you time your communications, you'll be dealing with the different phases of different events going through different hype cycles. But then finally on the bottom right there, you really need to make sure that your brand promise, as the advertising world would say, is matched by your brand experience. And that goes back to what I said about closing that say-do gap, meaning what you say, doing what you say. It's really, really important in the world of work, and for all leaders to do that, I think. When narrative goes right, this is a great sort of example from the Alamo. You know, the brave cavalryman got outside, and this is one of the great narrative techniques that I think is worth mentioning to people when they're doing communications. I think it's really important. He drew a line in the sand. You've heard this phrase, line in the sand. This is where it comes from. There was a line in the sand. He said, everyone who wants to stay in this fort and probably face certain death, cross the line and stay with me, and the rest of you are free to go. That's what we call a call to action. It's why Islamic fundamentalist communications, or ISIS's communications, have been so resonant. They've always had a call to action. It's actually the advertising reason why Brexit happened, because one campaign was called Remain and one campaign was called Leave. Which of those is a call to action? Okay, to remain is to do nothing. To leave is to get up and do something. So there's a lot of advertising sort of research around this, and actually it was MSC Saatchi that were doing the campaign to remain. So that's a bit of an own goal from the organisation I work for. But having a call to action in your narrative is really important. And so finally, I just want to put up this little, and I got this from a book from Richard Newman wrote called "You Were Born to Speak." And if you go and have a look at it, you'll see his approach. This is what he says is a great way to do an elevator pitch. Create the problem in someone's mind, first of all, because people don't need a hero until they have a problem. And if they think they've got a problem, tell them that problem, expose to them the true nature of that problem, overcome their bias that they might just be trying to overcome it themselves. Okay, so sometimes, and if you put it in terms of time, money, and values, then they know the scope of that problem. Once you've convinced them of that, 10% of the conversation, you then go on to the promise. And he always says, imagine the hand of Arnold Schwarzenegger reaching out towards you and saying, come with me if you want to live. You know, wouldn't it be great if it didn't have to be this way? What if this didn't need to be the case? And so then you really start getting people interested, and that's 10% of your argument as well. 75% is then what you do is the process and the proof. This is why this will work if you come with me. This is how I've done it before. The rule of three coming in, you know, use the journey reference. We're going to do this, then this, then this. That's a really proven speech technique. And then finally, the really important 5% at the end, which is the call to action. All you need to do now is, because if you get something moving, it's harder to stop it. So give me a call next week, or let's get Don into this meeting next week. Great idea. Yeah, okay, I'll set it up. That kind of stuff as well. And it's a sales technique, but I think it's worth noting in this communications world as well. So there you go. And then you've measured success indicators. And then that's the last stage of the process. You have to know what's output, you have to know what's performance, and you have to know what's effect. Because I can't tell if I've changed Nikki's mind. All right? I don't have that Vulcan ability to put my hand on her head and know what she's thinking. I can only observe her behaviors to find out if I've changed her mind. And the measurement of effect, what that I can assess is how Nikki's behavior might change as a result of my communication. No point in telling you how much output I've put into it, how many times I've said a certain thing to her. There's less point in actually talking about the measure of performance, of how many times she's read my tweets or anything like that. The only one that matters is measurement of effect of behavioral change. And then of course, don't forget that context changes all the time, so you have to be alive to that. So that basically is my approach on how you put communications at the center of what you do. And the aim, as I said, is to create an organization, especially in the modern world, that's going to be empowered, that's going to have trust, that's going to believe it's trusted to do the right thing all the time. And it comes down to, I think, my favorite quote from Stan's book, which is this. And this is actually what he used to say to SEAL Team 6 as they went out the door. If you get there and the mission we gave you was wrong, execute the mission we should have given you. And that's what I call complete empowerment, because he trusted the people to do, they exactly knew what the common purpose was. And that, I think, ladies and gents, is what we have to create in the modern world of communications. Now I've got lots and lots of comments coming up in the channel here, and I've sort of lost progress on them a little bit, Seth. So I don't know if you want to If
Right.
you want to shout out or just ask me questions.
Yeah, there's no, I didn't see that many other questions per se, just, yeah, people sharing some additional thoughts, etc. I think the EQ question from John definitely sparked a few interesting comments, because I think it is become an ever increasingly more important sort of topics. I think, you know, your point about it's always being there, I think I would be inclined to agree with that. Again, you know, I guess the context has shifted, so it's brought it into sharper focus. I think it was, yeah, chat along those sorts of lines. Alberto was asking if we'll save the chat. Yeah, we could do that, Alberto. I'll get the chat saved.
Really great insights that you put in there, Don. I've never, the adaptability quotient. Can you explain the sort of source of that? I haven't come across that, but I think I'd love to know more about it.
Well, it was a new book I was exploring by a chap called Ross Thornley, and it was Decoding AQ. It was just an idea I was exploring about maybe another potential speaker as well. Okay. But the science of human adaptability.
Yeah, I think I'll definitely have a look into that. I think you're right. I think you know, if we could probably produce a quotient to measure how organisations or individuals are in terms of their adaptability. I think that's great. That's fantastic. Mario, what do you mean when you get this is how you get rebel militia?
Well, you know, execute the mission which they've given you is basically asking the people to figure out my intent for them. So it's always a trade-off between the real degree of freedom, free thinking, and the real degree of meta-obedience that they have. That even when the mission I gave them is wrong, they will still be obedient enough to figure out what I would have wanted them to do and do it. And that's not, I don't think on an extreme spectrum, that's in all cases what you want to do. But of course, like you said on your triangle, it is highly context dependent. Without context, any of these thoughts or arguments make no sense. You have to have a context.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And context changes all the time. It really does. I mean, you only got to look through the you know, what we've lived through in the last 2 years. And yes, I know it's been one long crisis, but the sort of the peaks and troughs of everything we've had to experience have been, you know, like nothing else we ever expected to experience in our lifetime, I think.
What I meant by that was, my context was, for example, let's say you're parachuted behind enemy lines and everything went wrong, the intel was wrong. So you got to figure out a new mission based on the best information you got to save your life and bring the people back,
yeah, or
still execute the target. But another situation would be, well, government got corrupt and the same people would, using the same principle, might decide to go rebel and start fighting against the guys in power. So that was what I intend by context.
Yeah, I think you know, I think this statement applies when there is strong leadership, when there's strong moral leadership. It obviously applies if there's not as well, but I think it's a positive outcome when there is strong moral leadership. You know, I actually view Stan to be one of the most moral people I think I've ever met in my life. You know, he is a moral leader, and he will put people before anything, and that's so important to him. And I think that's probably why this statement has so much resonance for me. If you're interested in a bit more reading, by the way, there's these are the books that McChrystal Group has produced to date. You've seen Team of Teams. Chris Fussell was Stan's aide-de-camp in Afghanistan, actually. He's an ex-Navy SEAL and he's the president of our company now. But he actually, as a result of increased demand for how do you do this, when Team of Teams came out, he wrote a book on how to do the Team of Teams. It actually explains our techniques in more detail. The Leaders, Myth and Reality, which I talked about, basically takes a group of pairs of leaders, 12 pairs of leaders. And if I didn't know anything about this, but in Greek mythology, there was a character called Plutarch who, in Greek history, there was a character called Plutarch who compared the gods one against the other. And so it's called Plutarch's Lives. So Stan's taken a Plutarchian approach to leaders across the centuries. And he's not just talking about military and political leaders. He's people like Coco Chanel, Walt Disney.
The door's open, yeah.
Yes.
Say again? Sorry, that's all right. I thought it was another question, but people like Leonard Bernstein or people like that. So it's a good read. Margaret Thatcher's in there, and I think he's got Martin Luther and Martin Luther King in there as well, which is really interesting. And then he talks about General Lee because he idolized General Lee as a boy, and has of course been forced to change his opinion, completely change his opinion as he's learned more in his life. So that's a good read. I was telling Sath and Don at the beginning, when that book came out 2 years ago, we were all encouraging bookstores here in the UK to get as many copies as they can. And I went into Waterstones in London, said had they ordered the book, and they said, oh yes, we've looked in our system, we've got 1 copy on order. If that sells, we might sell some more. And I leaned over and quietly said, I think you should order some more copies, to which the lady behind the counter said, are you Stan McChrystal? That was probably the closest I got to fame. And then this is the book that's coming out. The last one there is the book that's coming out on the 4th of October, which you can pre-order now on Amazon. And that basically, Stan has realized, particularly in reference to the last 2 years, that we've become comfortable with this term risk, but we've defined it in terms of the external threats that we can do nothing about. When actually what you can do, and he does this via what he calls 10 risk control factors, is build up an immunity against risk, just as you build up an immunity against a virus. And the more you take care of the immune system, the better your reaction to risk will be, so that it makes us less risk averse, which of course we have to be to continue to progress. And that's a difficult message to get across to people. So recommend any of those. And of course, recommend that any of you, if you want to get in touch with me to ask me further questions, I'll be delighted. But that's all I've got. Team, it's been great to talk to you. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm happy to take any final points or questions or hand back over to the team.
Yeah, no, thanks, Gerry. No, it was good. A lot of good stuff, a lot of relevant stuff, a lot of very current stuff. No other questions. It's a small group, so happy to. Do you want to stop your screen share, because it's nice to see everyone's faces and stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so happy to open it up to the floor. If you've got any questions for Gerry, well, we've still got them. Feel free. Any other things that intrigued you, or things that you'd like him to clarify? Now's your chance. But we've still got them for a wrap up. John, you look like you're about to.
Yes, I am indeed, as you know. You have to excuse my pronunciation. General Krulak's laws of leadership came to mind halfway through your conversation. Was that something that inspired
John?
Yeah.
You're talking to the person, by the way,
Yep.
who read Team of Teams again when he was in the interview process for McChrystal Group.
Oh, there you go. That's good.
Now, but I'm not an avid reader. When was that published?
Oh gosh, it's actually a general in the American Army. I think he became the head guy, gosh, whatever they're called. And I've got 5 of them here. So it's offer them freedom to fail, and with it the opportunity to succeed. You've got micromanagement must become a thing of the past. You've got supervision must be complemented by proactive monitoring. You've got empowering them, hold them strictly accountable for their actions, allow the leadership potential within each of them to flourish, were the 5 laws that he established.
And you know what? I think if Stan was sitting here, he probably has read that. I would think if they're acquaintances, I'm sure he has probably. But he would say that his Team of Teams is nothing radical. It's basically his interpretation on human common sense behaviour and what he thinks people should do to create a functioning team. I think the thing that resonates with me most about Stan is that he says, if we're having a sort of rough patch on sales or anything like that, he'd say, look, come on, the money, we've got to get the money together, guys, but we've got to get the money together so that we can continue working in this team. That's what he wants to do for the rest of his life. He doesn't want to be a rich man. He just wants to work around good people. And I think that's the most empowering thing about working for a profession.
Absolutely.
Anything else, folks? Any question? You might get off lightly tonight, Gerry.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. No problem. Please do reach out, folks, if you want anything else from me. I'll be delighted to answer any questions. You can find me on LinkedIn. Normally posting something or other once a week on there. And listen, thanks very much for listening. I appreciate it.
When's your next leaders dialogue, and what might the
we haven't
what
booked September
might the session likely be?
Yeah, so we've had the last two we've done have been on inclusion. Actually, interestingly, I think Sath, you came to the first one.
I was on one of them. Yeah. Yeah,
the first one. So we took a 2-month break because it was summer holidays, and we had one late August, and we basically talked about what people were doing to encourage inclusion. I think that conversation's got a bit further to go. In terms of the things you are putting in place to make your organisation more inclusive. And I'm not just talking about diverse, I'm talking about that feeling of belief and belonging. Because that first one that you came to, I thought was an absolutely riveting discussion. We've got loads out of it. It really was. So we'll let you know, definitely.
I was just curious whether you were you had something slightly different, you were going to go in a different direction, but as you say,
well, we could.
Inclusivity, diversity topic still very hot.
I'd be really interested to get a straw poll from folks here, actually. I mean, if you were offered the chance to talk to senior leaders from all kinds of sectors or junior leaders from all kinds of sectors about a key leadership issue at the moment, what would it be?
Good shout.
I would say a key, we'll talk about recovering from the pandemic in terms of economic factors, which we're doing with, the hike in national insurance and all that kind of stuff that's going on. But are we talking about the emotional recovery of, communities, families, individuals? So, that's pivotal to the economy recovering. And I'm just not sure that's at the heart of conversations.
Do you think that I love that, Nikki. I think that's a lens I certainly haven't heard anyone talking about, and I haven't thought to talk about it myself, actually. So do you think that relates to leadership in organisations? Do you think organisational leaders have a role to play in that, as well as, I'm assuming, government?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it spans every sector, doesn't it? So I work for NatWest Bank, and for instance, we're now talking about this, hybrid model of going back to work and, a couple of days a month for some of us. But then, you've got to think about, the recovery and the drivers for people. So people have got used to this new way of working. They might have, long COVID family members that they can't leave. They might be, fear of the unknown. So there's all these things at play. And that's where I think organisations need to really lean into like personal coaching more to get to the nub of everyone's issue. So this is an issue right now, and I'm sure it will take different strands as time goes on, but I think it's the nub of society issues now. Yeah.
So I think that's if I can just read that back to you, I think that's the organisational, because I want to make sure I've understood it, because I think you're onto something there.
Yeah.
The organisation's role in the emotional recovery from COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's really stunning, actually. I love that.
Yeah.
I might steal that.
Go for it. And I'd be happy to come to these any of these.
I say the more the merrier. We have to limit it sometimes because it's
absolutely
too much, but we want everyone to speak. Yeah. And it does make me think, actually, whether we should maybe all open some dialogues up to a wider audience in a different format so that we can have a wider dialogue.
And I think as well, like we're quite fortunate because we move in these circles, but, underprivileged people don't, and they don't know about, what potentially they need or could be on offer to them. So it's thinking about society as a whole, actually. And, we talk about paying it forward, but I think we've all got a duty of care to each other because we were all in it together, and we still need to be in it together because it's like this whole mentality, no man left behind.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for that. I appreciate it.
There you go. You got a future leaders dialogue session topic out the future Work Scotland. There you go.
Do you know what? I know you guys love to talk to have dialogue as well. And my observation from our leaders dialogue is You know, that is the best way that everyone learns. When you listen, you're not just listening to one person, and I think it is better. I'm sorry if I've rabbited on a bit tonight, but I wanted to make sure I got through all the points that I think are relevant, and I hope you can take some guidance from. So
No, it was great. I think everybody got a lot out of it, and yeah, we'll certainly share around the recording. Some of the bits later on resonate with me quite a lot because I've been doing a lot of stuff in sort of social leadership. I've got a talk that I've kind of done a few times, which in that space there was a lot of commonality between some of the stuff you were talking later on about narrative and storytelling, and you know, you've got to get that kind of right. And my talk talks about a lot of the same sort of things. You know, how do you do that? Where do you do that? And to your point about, you know, the dialogue, I think more and more what we're realizing is we've got to go into the spaces where previously we didn't, where there are untapped, kind of unheard voices. And to me, that also kind of links in a little bit to, you know, the inclusivity, diversity agenda. So there's a lot of these linkages now, and I think that stuff works really well. And that's what it is. It's like in the past, they were always dominating voices. And, you know, you talked very early on about, you know, kind of somebody kind of pushing something, whether it's versus the kind of, would it be believed? Whereas in the past, these things were just kind of, you know, taken for granted. Whereas now we live in a sort of social age where these things are challenged and communication is more democratized, and it's much harder to just say something and everybody's going to just accept it, because they're not. You know, and that's really where the whole fact-checking thing kind of came from as well. So yeah, a lot of good stuff in there.
Oh, great. Actually, I come back on your point there and say, if we don't address those unheard voices, they will rise to the fore and surprise the heck out of all of us. It's almost like a duty to get involved as much as you can.
Any other quick questions? Maybe we've got 5 minutes. Then I'll wrap it up, give everybody a wee bit of time back. Anything else? No?
I think I have a comment more than a question, that I don't know how much confidence people have in authoritative speakers on what's going on right now with the pandemic, because there's been so much information that keeps changing. I just saw something today or yesterday about that they know that the virus is aerosolized. They know that a 6-foot space is not enough to stop an aerosolized virus. A few days ago, I saw something about that they've been putting up all these barriers, like plastic barriers, which now they think might be reservoirs for the virus. And then there's a question about if you're having people going back into these buildings, if the air quality, if you don't have the proper filtration in place, then you're not going to stop the spread of the virus, which meanwhile is mutating. I just read about Mu, which I guess is the one after Lambda, which is the one after Delta, that's coming up from South America.
It's incredible, Sheila, and I think, you know, we are. I don't want to belittle the seriousness of that problem, because it is serious. The amount of there's an infodemic that goes along with the pandemic in all its forms, and it has the same waves as the different variants as the pandemic itself, and the interpretation is really interesting. But I think if you track back to what I said about that hype cycle, and that is the way in which we expect to receive information almost now. So we're subconsciously conditioned to say whatever we hear first probably isn't true.
But that's the more that the experts speak authoritatively when they have no idea what they're saying, the more they open the door for what are now being called alternative facts, which are actually just lies.
Yeah. I agree. I totally agree. And this, I think, sort of strikes to the point of, you know, how far should people in authority and responsible governmental positions should be allowed to do that? When do they get held to account? You know, and they don't. The trouble is they don't, and because they are the account holders. I'm speaking for the UK government probably, and so we have to expect that we're not getting the whole truth in the latest sort of science that comes out, because it's got to be tainted by what the administration has put as its priority, whether that be economic rebuilding, whether that be immigration or something like that, there'll be something behind what the change in travel regulations, for example, and science will be used to back it up, and science may not be 100% true. And of course, something only needs to be 98% true to be untrue. That's the other thing about the world. The only truth, I said this at the end of my TED talk, the only truth we know to be true is the truth we know to be true about ourselves. That everything else, it is worth treating with a healthy degree of skepticism. And I think that's a good outlook to have, because I know everything about myself. I don't know everything about myself. I'm pretty much self-aware about what I can and can't do, and I know what I haven't done. And I know what my moral opinion is on this, that, and the other. I don't know to a degree of certainty about anything else in the world. And the amount of information that's present in the world makes that a much trickier sea to sail over as well. So I'm afraid my answer to you isn't very reassuring. We are always going to be beset with misinformation. And we have to cut through to what's important at all times if we can do it.
I think one of the things that can really help with that, and Sheila, I think that was a really insightful question there, is where do we allow the space for authenticity? So much of what we do in the corporate world is so scripted and so managed, whether it's a corporate town hall or whether it's a communication or even looking at a brand approach, it's entirely scripted. And then you get somebody like Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister coming in, who has a handheld mobile, who live, broadcasts from her mobile, and I believe her because I believe that she's real. How do we build that into our corporate space? How do we make that the achievable aim rather than this kind of scripted, shiny world that we live in? And I think that's a really interesting challenge for us as part of communities, as part of teams. How do we raise that up as a way forward?
That's a great question, Lindsay. And I wouldn't profess to have the answer. The thing I would offer as a sort of foundation of I think what you're asking is, we have not focused on content. In message, especially in corporate messaging. Corporate messaging has normally been focused on rhythm and reach before. It's on that structure. We've got something to say, set up a town hall. We've got something to say, put out a communique. We're going to have a meeting about this. Before we know it, we're having meetings and meetings. And I did an engagement with the MOD last year, and we found out across a single level of seniority, 48% of that seniority cohort's time in the week was spent at the meetings. That's half the working week was spent at going to the meeting, not doing their job, going to meetings. And most of those are repetitive and all that. So you're absolutely right. And not only is it, does it mean it's unauthentic, it's wasting people's time. It's making people less productive. And I think that's the other thing that we've suddenly realized, as we emerge from, or we go into a hybrid working scenario, we know now very, very clearly, it has been proven beyond doubt that a hybrid working scenario is more productive than an office-based working scenario. So what future the office, really? And there's no point. There's no point in owning a building. If you can work like this, if we can have engaging discussions like this, and then get together when we need to because there's a real tangible reason to do it, and then make sure that we take all the precautions and make sure that we look after each other and do it as well. So I agree with your point on authenticity, but I think it's also leads to a further point on a better operational outcome as well.
Well, there are also questions about how much to invest in a brick and mortar footprint if you need to retrofit in order to make it safe and habitable for people to come in for that hybrid work.
Yeah, because if you could pack 50 people into a floor plate before, and now you can only get 20.
Well, now they're talking about things like the ventilation system needs to be upgraded, and each one is going to be different in each building, and older buildings that weren't designed for any kind of central filtration are going to be harder to retrofit than the newer buildings that already have something like a central heating system in them.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know what the solution is, Sheila, and of course whole communities have grown up around these. You look at Canary Wharf in London, that's our example here, I suppose. Canary Wharf has been built around this, the office space and the services to support the office space, the shopping that's there, the accommodation that's there. I wonder whether the best use of these corporate buildings now is to make more housing and give people accommodation and optimize the amount of office space that we need for corporate activity. But I haven't done enough research on that to find out whether that's practical. I'm sure there are huge speed bumps that you'd have to overcome to do that.
I don't think that anybody's done the research. And I think that would be some of the questions if you were to talk to leadership in different companies, I would want to be finding out the answers is, have they thought about it? Have they thought it through? How do they see it influencing them? And there've been a lot of companies that have said they were going to have their workers come back in either full-time or in a hybrid way. And then they've had to back off of it because infection rates went up. Now I'm hearing in my local area that kids went back to school a couple of weeks ago. One friend has a son who's recovering because he caught COVID as soon as he went back to school. Another one, his kids are home and in quarantine for the next month because someone came into school with COVID.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's isolated. I don't think that's just happening in my area. I think that's happening all over the world, not just, I don't think it's confined to any one country.
That's a recurring pattern. That's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
That's happening at my son's school.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we're going to have to contend with for quite a while to come, especially if variants keep showing up. And if they're saying, and it's probably not quite as schizophrenic there as it is here as far as masks, because it's all controlled by local governments here. Some of it's at the state level, some of it's at the county level. Very little of it is at the national level. And they all change their mind every few days, but not in the same direction.
You're right. It's gonna be a challenge, and as you know, it was a mutating virus, and we knew that some time ago. So,
but the most basic question to me is if you're trying to establish or maintain credibility, and the experts no longer have credibility because the expert information keeps changing every few days, then how do you as corporate leaders reestablish credibility and confidence just in general in whatever you want to do moving forward in relation? And I think this virus is just a fact now. And then the other side of it is, if people talk about you need to be in the office to be productive, I was starting to say that I'd been working with geographically dispersed teams since the early 2000s, but then I realized I was working in New York in the late 1980s and half of my team was in Texas and a part of it was in New Jersey. So it's gotten much easier over time to collaborate remotely, but it's been going on for at least as long as as long as we've had computers and phone lines where you could set up a conference call or a speakerphone.
It's just that I think there's a lot of ego in it, isn't there? In rising to the top of the corporate ladder meant you were the head of the organization and you controlled the power. But I think, as I said, the information revolution of the 20th century has overtaken that. Because I get you, maybe something to take away is if we all go away and think, what is an expert? What really is an expert? And I've got teenage kids who they grow up in Scandinavia, and they're really questioning. They're saying, why do I need to go to university to listen to a professor in a building called a university to get the information I can get on my phone? And actually, I have some sympathy with them, because what I can say is you'll get a nuanced perspective from someone who's deeply researched that subject. But what they'll come back to me is that, Dad, they've just got their own opinion based on their experience of it, and I'd like my own opinion based on my experience of it. And so the whole business of learning, the whole business of, if we do have less office space in metropolitan areas, what does cities look like in the future? This is a fundamental change that's going on in our lives at the moment. It's not just. No, it is.
And I think it has a huge bearing on the future of works, right? So. And with that, I'm gonna draw it there, because we're up on time. We pride ourselves on sticking to time boxing, and right up on time, and yeah, a lot of really good stuff came up at the end, and I'm sure these things will feature in future sessions. But just to say thanks, Gerry, great to have you along, really enjoyed it. We'll get the recording out, and I'm sure others who couldn't make it along today will play it back and enjoy it and take a lot from it, lots of insightful chat, and yeah, I'm sure you'll have lots of these sort of ideas to take into future sort of leadership dialogues that you're having through your own group. Thanks for joining us, really enjoyed it, thank you. I'll give you a little hand there, someone muted, and thanks for all of you who are still with us, and thanks for your contributions. That's great. I don't have a huge amount of time left to go through everything. You know, we've moved to the monthly cadence. We've got a great session lined up with Dana Larson next month. So look out for that if you're interested in that. And we've just published our November session. We were just waiting on our speaker coming back to us. I'm really excited about that. So that's with Rod Judkins, who's the author of the best-selling The Art of Creative Thinking, which is a well-known book. He's got a new one called Make Brilliant Work, which is awesome. I've just finished reading it. I've been raving about it, and I'm actually doing a talk on it next week. A completely different community group. Yeah, we're excited to be hosting him. And we finished the year with Daniel Mezek, as you've probably seen. There's a lot of good stuff coming up, and the sessions are now appearing for 2022. So look out for those. And just very quickly, for you all, we've also got the Access Agile Festival, which some of you have probably seen. You'll remember Agile 20 Reflect. I was involved in that's emerged into Access Agile. They're doing a mini festival, pre-festival in October. So it's running for 3 days. I've just shared the link in the chat. You can have a look there. You get an idea of what they're trying to do there. Great program of events over 3 days. Lots of great speakers. It's all free. Stuff happening all over the world. Take a look, see what tickles your fancy. And yeah, you'll see me hosting a few sessions there as well. So hopefully see some of you there. And yeah, thanks for joining. Stay safe, folks, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you happen.
Thanks, Seth.
Thanks again, Gerry. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.